All right, thank you. I'm happy to be here. Here we are again, a year later, and I think we've made a lot of progress. So I see a lot of people that I recognize and some that I don't. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Chris Seabury. I'm a professor, tenured professor at the College of Vet Med at A&M. I came to College Station from Brewster County, Texas, where I lived on a ranch. I've been ranching a long time, have my own ranch. I'm not a deer breeder, but I do have a high fence ranch. So I know a little bit about ranching and a little bit about ag. I do a lot of work with dairy cattle and beef cattle. I do breeding values for them for traits, production traits, and for disease traits. And that type of thing has really revolutionized the dairy AI business, because we build better bulls by using breeding values. And that's the same approach that I've given you. So I want to take a little bit of time to just bring everybody up to speed. I'll show a few new things, but I don't want to dwell too much on new technical science. Then I'm going to talk about how to breed these deer, what to expect, what your results should look like and what they will look like, and how to breed these deer in the right direction as rapidly as you possibly can, and how to use deer situationally for maximum impact. So the reason we can do this today is that in 2020, we published a study, and it had about 3 important things that it did. It determined that the heritability of differences in susceptibility for CWD in farmed U.S. whitetail deer is high. That means that a lot of genetic progress can be made to reduce susceptibility. It means that the overwhelming majority of the risk can be explained by genetics. We also tested, using genome-wide data, all the different alleles for how strongly they were associated with risk or protection in relation to CWD. And we found that codon 96 was the most significant. It had the strongest protective effect with the S allele, and the G allele was enhancing susceptibility. Then we went on to do blind genomic predictions, where we blindly predict on samples using only the genetic data, and then we go and look and see how well did we do in predicting which ones were most likely to be positive. And when we did that, we had about an 80-something% success rate using nothing but genetics. I've since fine-tuned that process to be even better and done another different validation with USDA. But this year we published a new paper. We added more samples, we re-estimated the heritability. It was again high, even with 50% increase in sample size and representation from all over the United States, South, the Midwest, the Northeast, and we even determined that the initial estimates of the heritability that we provided might be somewhat conservative. It might even be higher than what we had initially estimated, which is fine. We like to be conservative when necessary. But then we also revisited this testing of alleles, and we again confirmed and found that codon 96S as a single allele has the strongest protective effect when we test all the alleles individually, all right? But we also note that the rest of the alleles that we're including have non-zero effects on risk. And so you can't really just rely on one allele. You need to use all the genetics, right? And in fact, I think I'm gonna write a new paper about this, because I find that people get confused about this all the time. And so I think the last paper that I'll write, I'll call it On the Heritability of Differences in CWD Susceptibility. And I'll estimate the heritability with all the data, then I'll delete all the prion codon data, estimate the heritability then I'll delete the whole chromosome that the prion gene is on, and I'll re-estimate the heritability, and you can see how much of the risk is explained by non-prion stuff, non-codon stuff. I've already done this before. And so I know what the result will be, but I'll do it with even a larger sample size now so we can put a nail in that coffin. In this particular study, we also found that it was always believed, because in other mammals that get prion diseases, they can get them sporadically, spontaneously. In fact, most CJD in humans is of the sporadic nature. That means we don't know why it happens, but it does, okay? We can't trace it to a source of infectious exposure. It's just some people get it. It's largely determined by genetics. So what I will say is you need to be careful when you, when you breed these deer. You definitely don't want to breed them too tight, because if there are genetic factors that can increase the risk for a sporadic case, and I'm pretty sure there are, and it's talked about in this paper with a direct tie-in to a human model of that, then I think you need to be careful. And we can discuss that a little bit more later. So what's new? I am working on elk. I'm making an array in elk. I'm going to take the exact same approach in elk that I've taken in whitetail deer, using genome-wide data to estimate the heritability, to test all the alleles, to figure out how to breed elk to be more durable, less susceptible to CWD. That's happening with funding from USDA through Texas Animal Health Commission, because the way they set the grants up is that the money has to flow through a state ag agency. I used to compete for the money as an individual from A&M, and that's the way I would get all my money on a national basis for research. But in this case, they set it up where it has to go through a state ag agency, and I don't know why, but that's the way it is. So what else is new? I'm going to get about 600 more whitetail deer that I'm going to put into the reference training data. Those are the data that I use to predict the breeding values on other animals, all right? So let me just tell you this now at the beginning of this talk. Even though what I'm telling you might seem a little complicated, it's really not, because you just have to ask yourself one question. Do you want to breed deer that are more genetically similar to the ones that pop positive at positive facilities in the United States? Or do you want to breed your deer to be more genetically similar to the ones that remain non-detect at positive facilities in the United States? Because it really is that simple. It really boils down to only that. How you actually get that done and the science to get there is complicated, but it really only boils down to that. And if you don't believe in that, then you don't believe in a genetic solution to this problem. I mean, that's it. And I'm okay with that, but there's no vaccine, there's no treatment, there's nothing else that's going to get you the level of relief that this will get you if you do what I say with your breeding scheme. So among those 600 deer, there'll be about 200 new positives that come from different places. And those will be very helpful in the prediction of breeding values for your deer. They will be helpful, they will be representative, and I expect that to make them even more accurate, all right? So I've already ordered the materials that I need to generate the data for these 600 animals, and I would imagine that sometime in the fall, I will retrain everything and then update all the breeding values. We're in discussions with Nader right now about how I can feed those right into the system so that when you log into your private login, you will see your animals privately and confidentially, their breeding values, and they will be updated in real time as we update the base training population, right? So we will always be striving to use more and more data to make it more and more accurate for you. And hopefully we get to a point where, we don't have depops to really add. We have maybe partial depops to add, and I'll talk about that as well. So I'm working with a positive facility. I sought permission I always talk about that, but I never say the name, but everybody knows that or they might know that it's Ox Ranch. And there's a very unique situation there in that they bought one deer that was positive. It lived on site for 20 months. It bred does for 2 seasons. When it wasn't breeding does, it lived in a buck pen with other bucks. It was moved around when deer were worked. It had 1 set of fawns when it died of clinical CWD. Yes, it did die. It was poor. It looked poor. Had respiratory disease. Wasn't responsive. Many deer that have CWD will ultimately die with respiratory disease, because like people with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's who have trouble swallowing, they end up aspirating some of their saliva, their food. It gets down in their lungs. It causes aspiration pneumonia. And certainly CWD weakens the animal as well. So that animal died, and there were a number of other bucks that it had lived with that died by fighting and various other circumstances. They did not test positive. They tested non-detect post-mortem. The does that were bred by the buck were euthanized recently, and they were still non-detect after 2 seasons of breeding with a positive buck. The fawns resulting from the initial year of breeding, non-detect. We had upwards of 60-something deer that were euthanized because they commingled, lived with, or were bred by the positive buck. No positive cases among those deer. No one could figure out why. Why hasn't it taken root here? Why hasn't it taken off the way that it has in other places? Well, there was one hypothesis that we could easily test. And I said, well, I mean, maybe this facility really has some outstanding genetics in terms of durability. We could test that. Let's test all these animals that we have these post-mortem tests on now, that were commingled or bred by this buck or whatever. Let's look at them. When we tested those animals, 88% of them were passing the cutoff. That is to say that they would meet or exceed the cutoff value that we're dealing with here. Now, I was using my other array, which is a bigger array, which uses 2.5 times as much data as the 50K, but the cutoff's very similar. And still, we had that result. So right then we knew that there was an opportunity here, a potential opportunity for a demonstration project that was very important to the industry, because if we could beat back CWD at this facility, then what it really means is that total and immediate complete depopulation is unnecessary in certain cases, right? If the herd is a good candidate for a cleanup, which is different than preventative breeding, which is what you're doing. If it's a good candidate for a cleanup, which requires more aggressive actions, then we might be able to actually rescue it as it relates to CWD. So that's what we're attempting to do. Some of the deer were live tested some time ago. They were all non-detect. In March, we live tested everything, which was 853 deer that were still present then. And we took rectal and tonsil biopsies. We've gotten 851 of those tests back so far, and they were non-detect. There were 2 with insufficient follicles that we need to get recut or need to have retested, but 851 non-detects. So in essence, that project was a field challenge, because we have a positive buck that became clinical, that bred does, that lived with other bucks, was moved around, and yet why didn't it take root and take off like it has in other places? There has to be an explanation for that. And the explanation is simply, a lot of that has to do with the heritability of differences in how susceptible the deer are. I think, based on all of my analysis and everything that I've done to the present time, all data supports the fact that increasingly negative breeding values, while also losing Gs at 96, moving away from the Gs and making them increasingly negative in their breeding values, builds deer that are more durable for CWD. They can tolerate some levels of exposure and not amplify the agent and not test positive. So like I said, I'm probably gonna write this new heritability paper, because I want people to understand and know that just because codon 96 has the strongest effects as a single allele test, when you test alleles all over every chromosome, doesn't mean that that's the only thing that you should be using, right? And I'll tell you something else. If you have a little piece of paper out, this is pretty important. If we have 1,000 deer, right? Let's just pretend we have 1,000 deer. You only need to do checkbook math for this, so it won't tax you very much. Let's say we have 1,000 deer at a facility with a 70% prevalence of CWD. That means we have 700 positive deer and 300 non-detects, right? If we go back in time to where a lot of our reference data comes from, the K and the H alleles are very low frequency in their occurrence, even in farm deer. They really occur at about a 1% frequency, all right? But let's be generous. Let's say 3%, okay? Let's just say 3, so the numbers are easier. At codon 95, I would have 2 alleles. They might be the same or they might be different, right? I got one from mom and one from dad if I'm a deer, right? There's 2. They're either the same or they're different. It's HH or QH or whatever, right? So that means that at codon 95, the total number of alleles present in that population of 1,000 deer is 2 times 1,000. There's 2,000 codon 95 alleles in that herd. If the H allele only occurs at 3% frequency, right? What is that? 60 alleles? And if the K allele occurs at 3% frequency, which is generous, 3 times the real occurrence, that's 60 alleles. Even if I give 1 H and 1 K to each non-detect in that herd, I can only cover 120 deer. How'd the rest of the 300 deer get protected, right? If there's 300 non-detects, because there's 70% prevalence, and there's only 60 H alleles and 60 K alleles, even if I give 1 to each non-detect deer to protect them, and I'm just making this up, right? I can only cover 120 deer. Doesn't even make mathematical sense. How can that be the only reason why 300 deer didn't get positive? It makes no sense. There's got to be other genetic factors that are contributing. There's got to be other things that are going on, and there is. We see that very, very clearly. So I want to revisit this. Before we start talking about breeding these deer, I want to just revisit this for a minute, because it's useful for people that maybe haven't seen it, or just as a reminder. We did a blind validation with USDA. They send me DNAs. I don't know what they are. I predict on them. For breeding values, I send them back like a test exam, tell them which ones I think are most likely to be positive. They tell me how well I did, okay? If we look at deer that had breeding values that were predicted in that blind validation of negative 0.15, there are only 7 positive deer in that validation that had breeding values that were that good, negative 0.15 or better, okay? That represents 5% of the positives. Only 5%, okay? But if we look at that same group of all deer, whether they were positive or non-detect, that have that same breeding value interval, negative 0.15 or less, there are 5 times as many non-detects at positive facilities that have breeding values in that range as there are deer that are CWD positive. A 5-to-1 ratio of non-detects to positives. And as we move in the more negative direction, that effect and trend only becomes increasingly strong and increasingly apparent. If we go to negative 0.20, we found 5 positives, or 3.67%. Negative 0.25, 1.47% of the positives. And when we got to negative 0.35 and we said, are there any deer that have breeding values less than that were ever positive? The answer was no, okay? Now, we don't have tons of observations of deer in that top category because there's not that many. But these deer all came from very infected, highly positive facilities with very tangible prevalence. So this trend is seen over and over and over again in multiple published studies and other studies that are ongoing, all right? So you know right then the direction of the effect, and you know what direction to breed those deer. So, like I said earlier, you either want to breed deer that are more genetically similar to the ones that test positive at positive facilities, or you want to breed deer that are more genetically similar to the ones that test non-detect at highly infected facilities. And if that's what you want to do, you need breeding values that are increasingly negative, and you need to lose the G's at 96. And anytime you can construct a breeding where you can do both things at the same time, that's what you need to do. Because you want to put on the full armor of protection and stack the odds in your favor as much as you possibly can. Because it's not a slam dunk 100% deal. The best I was ever able to do was 88% on average across all batches that they sent to me. Some of them I caught 100%. Some of them I caught 80%. I'll show you at the end the list of that performance. But I think I can do better. I think I can get it up to 90%. And I don't know where else you're going to get something that gives you that degree of confidence, because we just don't have anything else available right now. So this is just a recap of that blind validation with the total number of samples. Each one of those blue dots that's in the middle is a batch of samples that came in. If it says 1.0, that means I caught 100% of the positives. My average on post-mortem tissues in terms of diagnostics was 88% in this particular study, which is an improvement from my initial publication. Now, what do your breeding values look like? I did 1,000 samples before I came up here the other day, and to me, they're just laboratory barcodes. I don't know what they are. I mean, I know they're deer, but I don't know whose deer they are, what they are, where they are, nothing. So to me, they're numbers. Their IDs are numbers. And you know, this is kind of what the range of breeding values looks like among all the nadir samples to date. Not quite all, but 21,000. We've run almost 23,000 breeding value samples since last July, so right at a year. And I think about 69% of those have come from Texas. So very large number of those samples have come from Texas. You can see the old number line there going in the negative direction, going in the positive direction, centered on 0 there, and of course the cutoff on that 50K is negative 0.056. You want to know what side of 0 you're on. The cutoff value is saying, you know, that is the beginning of a statistically meaningful and detectable effect toward protection, right? That doesn't mean you want to live there at the cutoff, because that's like minimum spec. You want to push those deer in that left direction as far and as fast as you possibly can while losing G's at 96. So this nice little bell-shaped distribution, because this is a linear model, allows me to do a lot of things that are helpful for you. But you can see that if that's the cutoff, then about 35% of the animals that come through the testing end up passing the cutoff. But there are literally, I don't know, 7,000 animals or so that pass the cutoff. There should be plenty of material to breed with, is what I'm trying to say. And people are pulling old things out of tanks and figuring out that, you know, some of that is maybe lost treasure, lost gold. They pull things out that test real well, and they end up using them. And of course, we find new things all the time too. I got a call from a breeder the other day, actually from up north, who had a bunch of fawns in a batch of samples that I had run, and I noticed that batch of samples had a high proportion of individuals that were passing the cutoff. So I thought, man, this is a pretty good batch. And it turned out that he had a bunch of his fawns in there, and so those are all brand new deer that are all valuable and going in the right direction. So the best deer that's ever been tested on the negative side of the breeding values has a breeding value of negative 0.49. And even if I take that and I calibrate it with all the other deer and look at its genetic merit weighted by that and centered with 21,000 other samples, it doesn't change much. You know, it stays right where it is. I mean, at one time it could have been rounded to negative 0.5, and now it rounds to negative 0.49, so it hasn't changed much from when it was first run with maybe 4,000 or 5,000 samples to now, if I calibrate it with 20-something thousand samples, it remains the same. The deer that's on the opposite end of the breeding value spectrum is 0.51 positive, okay? The volatility in the breeding values is close to 0 and around the cutoff, right? So if you send a sample in and it barely has enough DNA to do the test, and the lab says that it meets the minimum spec of 90% of the data, then you send it in again, and 100% of the data comes, well, now I got 5,000 more SNPs to deal with or more to use on that animal. So you will see a little bit of variability there, but the average variability that we see across samples is less than or equal to 0.02. We've been keeping track of that through all batches. So what should you expect? Let's talk about how to breed these deer. And I'm going to use some numbers that are similar to numbers that I was looking at with a breeder who wanted me to give them some help understanding their results, right? Just double check it, all that. I changed them a little bit, but they're in the same sort of category of what I want to illustrate. And what I want to illustrate is that these two deer, the male, the buck and the doe at the top, have nearly equivalent breeding values. If you look at how much they differ by less than 0.02, okay? So they have nearly equivalent breeding values. So the expectation is that because of how sperm and eggs are made, the expectation is that because their breeding values are basically equivalent, half of the fawns should outperform the parents and have better breeding values. Half of the fawns should underperform the parents and have worse breeding values, right? And they're so close together that it would be improbable that one would land in the middle, but it can happen. In this particular scenario, it was a good example because the doe had been flushed. And we also had a lot of data about fawns from this pairing. And so what you can see is you have two fawns that outperform the parents at the top. Then you have two fawns that underperform the parents. And then, although improbable, it still happened that there was one that landed in the middle. So it's a perfect example of what you can expect when you breed your deer. Now, this is the expectation, and this is the average expectation. But what you will see sometimes is certain pairings of certain bucks and certain does will beat the average. They're a thrower. You know that from other traits, right? Certain bucks with certain does will beat the average. And maybe 65, 70% of the time, fawns will outperform the parents. You gotta watch your data, look through your data, identify those animals, identify those pairings, capitalize on that. We do that with dairy bulls all the time. I just had a multi-hour meeting the other day with a company where that's what I was doing for them, was pulling out the bulls that could throw that way, right? So just keep watching your animals. It has to do with how the good stuff is arranged on their chromosomes as to whether they'll be a quote thrower or not. I'm using that term because I know that's a term that you use and understand. But seeing something like this is totally reasonable. It fits with the exact random nature of how most sperm and eggs are produced. And so it fits the theoretical expectation perfectly. Now let's talk about something that's the opposite. We have parents that have really, really different breeding values. So they're very far apart, okay? We have one that has a negative 0.31 and the other, the doe, positive 0.12. When deer have breeding values that are very far apart, the offspring are going to land somewhere in between them. Most of the time. That is the average random expectation of what will happen, okay? And so, in this case, this is also a real example with the numbers changed a little bit. You can see what happened with those fawns, right? We were able to drag them over. Now, how far you can drag them over also is dependent on the pairing and on how the good stuff is arranged on their chromosomes. You have to pay attention to that because certain bucks will drag those breeding values over into the negative left direction far, far more than others. And it just has to do with how the good stuff is arranged and how many copies of the good stuff they have. Because think about it. If they have a lot of good stuff, but it's not just present in one copy, they didn't just get it from the paternal side, they got it from the maternal side too. Now every time they make sperm, they're putting the good stuff in the sperm, right? Because they got a double dose of the good stuff, right? Now, even a deer that's slightly into the positive range still has some good stuff, but they got more stuff that increases susceptibility than does decrease it, right? And so just because if you're weakly into the negative side at where we were a minute ago, well, actually, let's use one of these fawns. Negative 0.09. That deer is enriched for some good stuff, but it also has some stuff that isn't good, or it'd be more negative than that. You understand what I'm saying? So you got to keep track of this when you breed it, to learn to spot the trends and what is most productive for your goals. And if you do that, and you approach the breeding to take animals that are situationally appropriate, then you will maximize how quickly you can get there. How quickly can you get there? Well, if you engage in extreme matings, okay? We do this with the dairy bulls and cows too. Here we have a buck and a doe that have pretty negative breeding values, right? And they're very similar. So either the fawns are gonna outperform the parents or underperform them, right? Best deer ever tested was created exactly this way. The best deer ever tested was created exactly this way. So you also don't want to limit yourself to just one category of buck, you know, for your breeding either. You need to test your does, because if you think that you're just going to test your bucks and that's going to do it for you, it's not. It's like a shot in the dark. You don't know what your does have, you don't know what to expect, and you cannot move in the correct direction efficiently, okay? So you must test your does. You need to also know what the codon 96 genotype is. And I'll tell you why in a minute, beyond just what we've been talking about. One reason is that a 96 GG buck with excellent breeding values can be like gold if it lives in a tank, because it's of no risk to you on your facility. It can't get positive because it's dead. Its semen lives in your tank. But if you breed that 96 GG buck, let's say it's got negative 0.35 breeding values, you put that on SS does that have negative values, now you're going to get all GS fawns, right? And you're going to be going in the right direction and losing Gs. You're going to put an S on every fawn. And then now they're all GS and you can make SSs. But if you limit yourself only to SS bucks, then two problems can happen. One problem is that you can breed deer too tight. The other problem is that you're limited to what SS bucks are currently known and available and what their breeding values are. If you can't find an SS buck that has a negative 0.35 breeding value, but you want an SS buck and now you're forced to use one that has a negative 0.15, right? That's not going to raise your ceiling on that breeding value going in that negative direction as quickly, right? So you have to be mindful of both, because to put the full armor on, you need both. And that's where a buck like this can come in handy if you have SS does. SS does are just as valuable, if not more valuable, than an SS buck. And so what I propose, and I proposed this at the Nader board meeting, but it needs to be, I was counseled that it needs to be breeder driven, okay? I think we ought to openly identify the top 100 bucks. I think we ought to openly identify the top 100 bucks that have the best breeding values and what their codons are, so that people can source and use them, and then we can make their replacements, right? So it creates a little bit of a healthy competition maybe that stimulates the production of better sires, where then people can source the material that they need and not breed too tight with a handful of bucks. So why am I harping on the too tight, because I promise you, if you breed those deer too tight, you're enriching for a bunch of recessive broken genetics. And one thing you'll see is maybe rectal prolapse, where they start pooping their butthole out, or recurring foot problems in the hoof, or infections that you can't resolve, or recurring annual pedicle infections on the same deer. And I could just go on. But you can also cause a metabolic syndrome that I think can lead to a sporadic case of CWD if you breed them way too tight. And so what we don't need to do is use the same 1 or 2 bucks, in my scientific opinion, that are SS for everything. We need to identify the top bucks. We need to have people engage with others. That's the biggest complaint that I get, is people call me up and say, I can't find what I need. And I tell them, well, I can't help you because I don't know what any of the stuff is. I know there's plenty of good stuff, but I don't know what it is. It's all anonymized to me unless somebody calls me. Usually if their deer test well, they call me, right? But I still can't tell somebody unless they want me to, because they want to sell semen, right? And I'm not a broker. So I'd rather y'all take this into your hands. And if you do that, I think it will maybe also even generate some new events, some maybe new income streams, things like that. But we have select sire indexes in dairy, right? We have sire indexes, and we use them. Why can't we move toward that so that people can find what they need and diversify enough that they can get the traits that they want, but also get the protection that they need? That's what I propose that we do. So again, pay attention to your pairings, look at your resulting fawns, find the deer that throw best, and try to make your best does and sires, but don't just put your emphasis on those sires. An SS doe with good negative breeding values is like gold, okay? So just to convince you of this is 24 depopulated deer farms across the state of not Texas, but including Texas and every other state in the United States where these depops happen. There's actually 24 farms now. If I go in and calculate in the training data, this isn't a prediction. This is a directly estimated value. In the training data, these deer are all dead. They were all had post-mortem tests at positive facilities that had high prevalence. If I go and calculate the average breeding value in the training data, with a couple thousand samples, the non-detects have an average breeding value of negative 0.20. There's variability, but that's the average. The positive deer that are CWD positive in the training population have directly estimated breeding values of positive 0.4, okay? Now again, this is not a prediction. These are direct estimates, because when we estimate their breeding values, they come from positive facilities where we know they were exposed. They've all been depopped, post-mortem tested, so we have a diagnostic phenotype and their genetics that we can estimate their breeding value from. That's different, because when you send your stuff in, I use the training population to make the breeding value prediction. And the number that you're getting is tagging lineages. It's tagging lineages of what is more common in non-detects and what is more common in positive deer. And it all folds up and boils down to that one thing. Do you want to breed them to be more genetically similar to the positives or genetically similar to the non-detects? So the direction of the effect is unquestionable, unequivocal. We know where to go. So that's about it. That's what I came to talk about today, how to apply it, show you how much data we've generated, make a proposal about identifying the top 100 bucks. Of course, those could be replaced and should be across time as the sire index grows and people are more successful. And I'll answer whatever questions that you might have. Yes, sir.
On the positive deer, have you had any with a negative value?
I showed you that slide, yes. It just doesn't happen very often. Yeah. It boils down to a probability. How many people know that the scrapie resistant sheep can still get classical scrapie? Does anybody know that? It happens, it just doesn't happen very often. It's a low probability event. There's papers published about it, but this is exactly the same thing, only we're using a breeding value. The more negative it becomes, the lower the probability is that they'll be positive.
You have a slide that had you were talking about a dead buck with semen in the tank that was GG.
Right.
And I have a group of does that are SS. Short of the breeding too tight, why would I take those SS does and put them with a GG if I want to keep SS on my offspring on those alleles?
Because maybe the only SS buck that you have has a breeding value of negative 0.05 or negative 0.10 or negative 0.15.
So the value of that GG buck, obviously if it's low enough, trumps the...
It doesn't trump it. It's a stepwise thing. How fast are you going to get there? That pairing that I showed that had almost equivalent breeding values, there were two fawns that came out of deer that had about a negative 0.09 breeding value. There were two that came out of there at about negative 0.13, negative 0.12. So you made an incremental advance in the negative direction. But how far of an advance can be made would be if you don't have an SS buck to breed to those SS does that has really good negative breeding values, then it's going to take you more generations to move your deer far in that negative direction than if you took that GG buck in the tank with, say, negative 0.35 and you made GS fawns with an SS doe that was negative 0.25, you might get something negative 4 out of that. Then they're all GS, then you can make SS. But you have to do your own risk assessment about this. There's risk in using the same SS buck for everything because we all have genetic load. How many people have used 23andMe or something like that? And you get this little report back and they got themselves in trouble with the FDA because it was too diagnostic. But you get a report back and it might say, hey, you've got this mutation that's been associated with late onset Alzheimer's, right? Well, are you going to go home and gnash teeth about that? I hope not, because that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get it, right? It just means that it is a risk factor, one. And all of us have lots of those all over our chromosomes. And if we were to marry and procreate with with really close relatives, that would bring about recessive enrichment for those, okay? And lead to negative things. So even a buck that's a great thrower, that's got, everything you could ever want in production traits, and it's an SS, and it's a negative, 0.25 or whatever, it still has some load. Every deer out there's got some load. All of them. So you should not restrict your breeding to one buck. That'll be a mistake. I'm telling you right now, don't do that. There's a lot of problems that could happen with that. If you want to keep using it, you can, but you need to kind of diversify somewhere along the way, You don't need to use it on 20 does and then come back and get the doe fawns and use it on 20 doe fawns and then come back and do that again. No, I don't recommend that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What's been the response to the idea of a registry? I mean, how would we go about promoting that? To do it to APR or to organizations?
Well, we have a registry. The registry is long established. I think you mean the SIRE index or the top 100. I think, if TDA wanted to do that, they could organize it. It could be voluntary. I mean, I don't know. They would have to, that would be a talk between TDA, its members, and, Nader, and let the producers organize that if that's what they want. But I'm just telling you that I'm getting a lot of requests to help people find things, and I'm not the guy that can help them find it unless somebody tells me about what they've got, because I don't know. It's all anonymous data. I think we should be talking to each other more. And one way to do that is to make a sire index if people want to and are willing to and want to wade into that, you know? I know people like that have certain things people want. This guy right here, I'll send some people to. But I don't know what everybody has, so I can't possibly meet the demand of the number of phone calls I get where people are trying to locate semen, right? I just can't. So this is something that needs to be handled internal to the industry. Yes, sir.
You mentioned scraping with sheep. The genetic testing with scraping with sheep, I would assume, is more advanced than it is with whitetails because scraping's been around a lot longer. How far has genetic testing led you toward eliminating scrapie in sheep?
Genetic testing in sheep with scrapie is actually less advanced because the technology that we're using now wasn't available when the scrapie eradication program started. If we would have done in sheep what I'm doing now, we would have accelerated that eradication program, probably reduced the amount of time by 50% or maybe even 2/3. But the scrapie program is well under control. It's just that in sheep, the codons in sheep explain more of the risk than they do in deer. And the alleles at the codons are far more common. So if you think back to the example I gave you with 1,000 deer and how few H's and K's were there weren't enough to protect all 300 of those deer. In sheep, the codons that are protective are common, much more common than some of the alleles like H's and K's in deer. And in sheep, the prion codons explain by themselves about 80% of the risk. And so when you take that and you put that selective breeding with infection control and best management practices, over the course of 15 or 20 years, we reached the scrapie eradication program benchmark now where we've reduced scrapie by greater than 85%, the incidence of it, right? And it's odd that the numbers that I hit on the blind predictions are almost identical to the amount of reduction in prevalence of scrapie in sheep for the National Scrapie Eradication Program. What they'll say in their data is that they reduced the prevalence of scrapie by greater than 85%, and I hit 82% in the first study, 88% in the second study. So I'm right dialed into that same spot, which doesn't really surprise me, you know? Yes, ma'am.
The farming we were talking about in the beginning with the positive buck and no other positives.
Yes.
How many years will you monitor that farm?
Well, it's on a herd plan because it's considered a positive facility by way of buying the one buck. We're already almost 3 years since that buck was brought in, right? And we're still not finding any. And we've been under quarantine over there for more than a year. So technically we will monitor for 4 more years, but based on the herd plan that was negotiated, if we can keep CWD out of there for a certain duration of time, then we will gain additional freedoms in the future. And so my goal is to be aggressive in case there's any slow cookers. And also I need a demonstration project to demonstrate that we can turn a herd around. That doesn't mean that they can all be turned around. Because if somebody called me up and said, go over and clean this herd up over here that's positive and they have 60% prevalence and I haven't even pre-screened the herd, I don't even know what they have to work with genetically, right? Let's say I go over there and I test all the deer and all the deer test in the moderately to highly susceptible range. I got nowhere to go. If I'm gonna whittle the deer down based on genetic merit, then I'm not gonna have anything left. So to be a good candidate for a cleanup, you need to have the right genetics. And if you have the right genetics, then I don't think you're gonna have high prevalence. It's not gonna take root and take off like it does in other places, right? Yes, sir.
Along with what you just said, if there is a slow cooker at Ox Ranch and it pops up in a year or two, talk about transmission. I mean, they killed every deer that was in physical contact with that buck. Are we assuming that if it's a positive in a year or two, it's a slow cooker, or is it just a new this fall?
No, I would say it's a slow cooker because I just know other things about the data.
Statistics says it is, but
Yeah.
you got to talk about transmission and how's that happen?
Well, I mean, everyone knows that runoff, birds, there's no fence in the sky, varmints, scavengers, whatever. That could play into it. But what I'm trying to tell you is that if you prepare yourself by breeding the deer in the right direction, the right way, even if, and I can be successful at that site, I think that it changes the calculus and the regulatory response to a positive. Because it's not just, we have to kill them all now, right? It's, what do we have to work with over here? How much prevalence do we have? Can we tame it down? Can we turn it around? Can we prevent it? So you position yourself for that as an insurance policy in the future. A lot of it hinges on what happens over there, but so far, what's happening over there is going in the right direction. And I can only hope and pray that that's the way it keeps going. So, but again, a cleanup is a much more aggressive action than preventative selective breeding. You're using the 50K for preventative selective breeding. You can be as aggressive as you want, or there's a few people that don't, they don't want to hear from me. They think I don't know what I'm talking about. But some of the greatest scientists in the world reviewed these papers because they often reveal themselves afterward to comment about the quality of the paper. And so I am 100% confident that this is correct.
So with all the new data that you have with a clean facility, have we calculated what the actual risk of popping a positive test is into a closed herd?
No, but it's, it would be small. It would be affected by, if tight breeding could lead to a sporadic case, that would contribute to that probability. If you have a neighbor that's positive and scavengers are in the area, that would contribute to that probability. But in a clean facility, in a closed herd, obviously, what about semen, right? This buck was positive. He bred does for 2 years. None of the does were positive. So regulators might say, well, how do you know he put the agent in his semen, in his sperm? That could be a trait. Yeah, it could, but I mean, I think that in a clean facility, the probability is dependent upon if there's CWD outside your facility in proximity and how it might get in there or how you might bring something in there, right? Or if you breed the deer too tight and you touch off a sporadic case like in Norway, then now you got a problem. But it's unquantifiable, it's low. But I don't have that number in my back pocket for you.
Are we talking less than 10%, less than 2%, less than 1%? I mean, we make all kinds of predictions and numbers. I'm just curious, we have the data that we should be able to figure what the actual probability is.
That probability depends on business practices. That probability depends on what you're bringing in terms of feed, supplements, where you're going to visit. If you're going back and forth to positive facilities, that probability is a lot more complicated than I'm a closed herd and how many closed herds for 5 or more years have ever been positive. We know in the state of Texas that number is small, single digits. So it would be single digits out of maybe 1,000, which is how many facilities that we had before a decline in the number of breeders. Yes.
When you're dealing with like Animal Health Commission on all this stuff, I mean, do they take your research as like,
Does Animal Health Commission or the people you're doing the testing with and samples and you're getting your 88% and stuff, are they buying into what you're doing as like a positive thing, or is it like a usage just for deer breeders? I mean, because honestly, especially in the elk thing, I mean, if this is if this this is as big as I can see it being, I mean, they could use that and really buy into it. Do they give you good positive feedback on what you're doing?
Yeah, but they have to, because when you publish papers that are peer reviewed in science by international experts, that's not just a mutual admiration society. I mean, we're talking about people in the UK, people in Australia. You know, by definition, as a quantitative geneticist, I'm a professional animal breeder, okay? And other people that are quantitative geneticists in crops are also professional crop breeders. So, you know, when you do that and you publish those papers and they get good reviews and they get published and accepted, then they have no choice but to go along with it, you know? You know, I would say that my interactions with regulators are 50-50. There are a good number that really want to resolve the problem and are happy to work with the industry to resolve the problem and want the problem to be resolved. And there may be some others that are sort of maybe conservation ideologists who don't believe in high fences or believe in non-traditional animal agriculture, I would say. And I do traditional and non-traditional animal agriculture. So I'm going to be an advocate for ag, and you know, that's just where I stand. It's no secret. Yes?
Can you explain, when you add animals to the training population, which range of animals will move the most as far as the numbers go as you get more accurate in prediction?
The closer they are to the cutoff, or the closer they are to zero, is where they'll move the most. That's where there's the most volatility, because you're trying to quantify, you're quantifying a slight enrichment for something good, or a slight enrichment for something that enhances susceptibility. So the closer you are to zero, the more that it could change. The animals that are further away from zero, even if you calibrate with 20-something thousand animals, they don't hardly change at all. Yes?
I heard you mention the two different things in your talk that I hadn't heard before your talk. One was the spontaneous CWD positives potentially being due to type breeding. And if you could elaborate more on that. And then secondly, the thought of scavengers spreading CWD, if there's any evidence of that maybe I'm not aware of.
That's already been published in the peer-reviewed scientific journals. Tim Condit's probably the smartest guy I know about that. He's been talking about that for a long time. So that was crows they did a study on, and there's other published studies that show that scavengers can eat on an infected carcass, then go somewhere else and defecate and bring the agent with them. The sporadic thing, you know, the most common prion disease in humans is sporadic CJD, right? That's the most common designation. We don't know why it happens. But now we know, after I published my deer paper, the human group came out and they said, hey, you know, we see the same thing as he sees in deer. It's not just the prion gene, there's other genetics that are associated with sporadic CJD. That's fairly new, okay? But what about, does anybody remember those Papua New Guineans that got kuru because they would eat their relatives in a cannibalistic feast at a death ceremony? They'd eat their brains. Anybody remember that? Well, where did the first one come from that had kuru? I mean, it's believed that they were eating relatives that had sporadic CJD, right? The equivalent of that. And that's how they got kuru. Well, where did scrapie come from in sheep? We've known about it for hundreds of years, since at least 1792. Where did it come from? It probably came from a sporadic case that was disseminated in the field, maybe in afterbirth or other bodily tissues or excretions or secretions, right? Touched it off. The Norwegians have a couple of very nice papers that say that that very thing's happened in Norway as it relates to the reindeer, caribou. One that had a sporadic case, others, they're all densely packed together. One starts gnawing on the velvet of the one with the sporadic case. It's in the blood and the velvet. Now that one's got it. Now that one can disseminate and shed. And I just think that if you do breed too tight, then what can happen is you can enrich for some of that load that we all have and that all deer have, and bring out those recessive traits, and that can cause a sporadic case or increase the probability of a sporadic case, I would say. I do see some evidence through comparative tie-ins that's in my more recent paper about that. It talks specifically about that, which has been seen in humans. Yes?
Your negative scoring animals that are testing positive?
Yeah.
It's always associated with the G allele?
Not always, but if I go and I look and I ask myself, is there anything in common among the ones that I missed that were positive because they passed the cutoff? Is there anything in common? And that there does seem to be an overabundance of G there at 96. They're not uniformly 96 GG, but most of the ones that I missed would be. But you know, there's also a kind of an expectation for that because it's a more common allele than S in certain regions of the United States, right? So S is more common in southern genetics than it is in northern genetics.
Are you having SSs test positive?
We have 20 or more SSs that have tested positive, but they didn't really score well and they were in highly infected facilities. But we've got a lot more that didn't test positive. But if you only use the SS as your indicator, you're going to lose a lot in the way of how much risk you can reduce, because the S could be the only really good thing they have. You understand what I'm saying? They could be missing out on a lot of other good stuff that you could get if you would just look for the S and look for the negative and make it more negative.
Are your H's and your K's on your 95, are they always associated with a G on the 96?
No, I can see an S with a K. I can have HS deer. Up north, they were hopeful that the HS deer would be the resistant deer. They were putting some on infected ground and they hadn't seen a positive yet. They didn't have a big sample size, but I have multiple deer that are HSs and positive. I have pretty much everything I have most everything that's been positive when I look at 24 farms, right? In terms of single codon stuff. I have most everything.
Are there enough of the H's and K's to determine the susceptibility yet? Or are they just so rare that there's not enough data on it?
No, that's actually a great question. And are there enough H's and K's in our research data to determine their merit, their worth, their value for protection? And the answer is yes. You know, the H has an effect that's weaker than S, but bigger than K. And K has an effect that is far weaker than S or H. Yes?
What role does age play into that? Because like the SS that are positive, are they older when they're positive?
Yeah, that's a good question. It just depends. It's kind of, because the way I look at this is, I look at their breeding values first, then I look at what do they have there. And so whenever I do this analysis, these are very good questions. One thing that I do is I treat them like cattle, and I make contemporary groups of animals, right? And you already do that because you have buck pens and your bucks in the pen are the same age, you know? So when I do the research and I fit the model to estimate the SNP effects and the breeding values and all that, I correct for age as a variable. I also will correct for farm as a variable. And the reason that we do that is to remove the effects of different management strategies at the different farms from the genetic estimates, right? And so it's fairly sophisticated. I don't say all that because then Rob will tell me that I dropped the ball and it was too much mad science, and he'll send me home in a bad mood, you know?
I think you touched on this, but what about age again, like breeding a 12-year-old up? How bad is that?
Well, I guess if I'm going to give you the honest answer, it won't be simple. But some of the deer that were the oldest at positive facilities were valuable because they predated the initial exposure to the disease, and they lived throughout the disease process all the way to the end when they were depopped. And when we ran breeding values on them, they scored real well. And so that made sense because they didn't come up positive, but how? You know, they had lived before, during, and all the way to the end of the disease process at the depop. But at the same time, we all know that as we age, the probability of a neurological disease in a sporadic form, like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's or even CJD, increases with age. So, like I said, I mean, I'm not a deer breeder, I'm a rancher. But if I was a deer breeder, then, you know, I think that I would not strive to have the oldest deer possible around. You know, I think that I would have the average age of my herd be lower because I'd be turning my animals over trying to get to where I wanted to be. That would be what I would do if it were me.
Could the age of the animal possibly change your numbers? No.
Like I told this young lady, I already removed the effect of age from the models and predictions, but the more data we get, we see less of an effect on age. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that when CWD first started happening and we started depopping and we started finding positive facilities, we weren't really finding it much in fawns, right? But more recently, we have found it in younger deer. And what I mean is younger deer whose mom wasn't positive. If mom's positive, she's pumping CWD into the baby directly, putting it into the baby's tissues via blood, okay? That's already known and published. I'm talking about mom's non-detect, fawn's born, and the fawn at the depop 6-8 months later ends up testing positive, right? Well, you know, when I go back and look at some of those, they are much more susceptible than mom was. And the breeding that was constructed there made that happen. It's just they didn't know it because they couldn't see it with their eyes. They were breeding for something they could see with their eyes, not something that we pulled out of their DNA, right? Well, and I just want to say, look, it doesn't matter to me if you think that I don't know what I'm talking about, that's fine. You know, if you think you got something better planned to do, you're not going to hurt my feelings. You know, and if you want to have a healthy debate about it, I'm happy to do that too, as long as it can be done respectfully. But if we'd have gone over to Ox, for instance, and after that one positive killed all those deer, we would have killed 1,000 deer that would have tested non-detect. And I just don't want to do that anymore. I just think there's a better way. And I realize that maybe some people, they won't like me because maybe they got a score back on a deer that they didn't like. Well, you know, I'm just the numbers guy. You know, I'm the guy that crunches the numbers. So, but we need an alternative solution to total and immediate depopulation. Otherwise, you may not be having these types of meetings in the future. You know, it's going to contract so much that it won't be sustainable. So we got to inject some new technology, and we have to change a little bit in how we do things. And you know, one of the things that I'll end with is that it always irritates me when my wife starts telling me things that I need to do when it's something that I don't really want to do. I know that she's right, and I already knew that it's the right thing to do, but I know it's going to be a pain, and I'm not looking forward to doing it. So I just don't want to hear about it, right? And so I know that some people like to breed certain ways and do certain things, and then I get up here and they feel the same way that I feel when my wife's telling me something, right? They know probably that I'm right. They just don't want to hear about it anymore, and they just don't want to do it. But I wouldn't be telling you this if I didn't think that it was the right thing to do. I wouldn't have these papers published if it was junk and trash. So just take that into consideration when you have a healthy debate with me if you aim to do that.
Let's give Dr. Singer a round of applause.